My parents stole $10,000 from me to buy my sister a car. Now they expect me to forgive them like nothing happened, but I'm not sure I can. I still remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of day where nothing exciting was supposed to happen. The sky outside my apartment window was a dull gray, threatening rain but never delivering, the kind of weather that made me want to stay in bed for just 5 more minutes. Instead, I dragged myself to my desk, balancing a half-empty coffee mug in one hand while booting up my laptop with the other. Rent was due, and I had developed a habit of double-checking my finances before making any payments. Not that I needed to. I'd been saving diligently for months. My account should have had more than enough. But when I opened my banking app, my stomach dropped. My balance was wrong. Way wrong. I blinked, thinking maybe I had misread it. I refreshed the page. Nope. $10,000. Gone. I sat there, frozen, my coffee going cold in my grip. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. A glitch in the system? Maybe the bank was experiencing technical issues? But as my heart pounded in my chest, I clicked into my transaction history. My fingers were trembling, making it harder to scroll, but when I finally reached the suspicious charge, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't just missing, it had been transferred. A lump formed in my throat. This wasn't a hack, wasn't some fraudster in a distant country draining my account. This was an authorized transaction to an account I didn't recognize. But here was the kicker. It had been made from a familiar device. My device, according to the bank's security settings. My breath came faster, my mind racing through the possibilities. No one else had access to my bank account, or at least no one should have access. But then a cold realization crept up my spine. My parents had my banking details. I had given them access years ago, back when I first set up my account in high school. It had seemed harmless at the time, a safety net in case of emergencies. But this was not an emergency. This was theft. I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed the bank, my pulse pounding in my ears as the call connected. Thank you for calling First National Bank. How can I assist you today? Hi, I need to report an unauthorized transaction, I said, trying and failing to keep my voice steady. Of course. Can you confirm your name and account number? I rattled off my details, barely able to focus as the customer service rep typed away on the other end. All right, sir, she said after a pause. I see the transaction you're referring to. It was an account-to-account transfer completed using your online banking credentials. Yes, but I didn't authorize it. I snapped, my patience unraveling. I understand your concern, she said, her tone remaining maddeningly calm. However, the transfer was made from a recognized device and was not flagged as suspicious. I felt my jaw tighten. You mean someone logged in using my details? From my own device? Yes, sir. My grip on the phone tightened. There was no doubt about it anymore. This wasn't a random cybercriminal. This was someone close to me. Someone who had access. My heart pounded as I hung up and immediately dialed my mom. She picked up on the second ring, her voice as warm and casual as ever. Hey, sweetie, how's work? I didn't bother with pleasantries. Mom, did you take $10,000 out of my account? Silence. A beat too long. Then, a nervous chuckle. Now, before you get upset. Mom, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Tell me you didn't. There was a long sigh on the other end. It's for your sister, she finally admitted, her voice shifting into that tone she always used when she wanted to justify something outrageous. She needed a car, and you weren't using that money for anything important, so I didn't hear the rest. My ears were ringing. My own mother had stolen from me. Not borrowed. Not asked. Stolen. And she didn't even seem to think she had done anything wrong. Mom, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. That was my money. My savings. Sweetheart, I know, but she really needed it, she said, as if that excused everything. And you always help family. You know that. My vision blurred with anger. So you just took it? Without even telling me? We were going to pay you back, she said quickly. Once your father's bonus comes in. That's not the point. I exploded. You didn't ask. You didn't even think to ask. You just decided it was okay to take $10,000 like it was spare change. You're overreacting, she huffed. It's just money. Just money. I let out a bitter laugh, one that didn't sound like me at all. Okay, fine. Then give it back. Right now. There was another pause. Longer this time. Sweetie, we can't just... Unbelievable. I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I could feel my whole world shifting. It wasn't just about the money anymore. This was betrayal, a complete violation of trust. And I knew in that moment that this was far from over. Hanging up the phone, I felt a knot of frustration tighten in my chest. I needed to get control of this situation before it spiraled further. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. If they weren't going to give me a straight answer over the phone, then I'd confront them in person. My parents only lived 20 minutes away, but the drive felt longer with my mind racing in circles. Every possible scenario played out in my head. Would they double down and justify their actions? Would they act like I was the unreasonable one? Would they even care how betrayed I felt? By the time I pulled into their driveway, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. I got out, slammed the door behind me, and marched up the front steps. I rang the doorbell and waited. A few seconds later, my dad opened the door, his face lighting up in surprise. Hey kid, didn't know you were stopping by. Yeah, well, I need to talk to you and Mom. Now. His smile faltered. Sure. Come on in. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of my childhood home washing over me. Fresh baked bread, lemon-scented cleaner, and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. I spotted my mom in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face a mixture of surprise and unease. Oh, honey, what a surprise. What's wrong? I clenched my jaw. You know exactly what's wrong. Let's sit down. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. My dad cleared his throat and sat across from me. My mom hesitated before taking a seat beside him, still holding onto the dish towel like a lifeline. Now, I said, leveling my gaze at both of them, let's talk about my money. The room was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. My father rubbed his temple, his eyes downcast, while my mother clutched the dish towel like it was a lifeline. We thought it was for the best, my mother finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I scoffed, shaking my head. For the best? You drained my savings without a word. Do you even realize what you've done? My father sighed, standing up to pour himself a drink. Look, son, we know this isn't ideal. Not ideal? I cut in. It's fraud. Theft. Do you know what kind of mess you've put me in? Their lack of immediate remorse only fueled my frustration. I slammed my hand on the table, making my mother jump. I want my money back, and if I don't get it soon, I will take legal action. My mother gasped. You wouldn't do that to your own family. Watch me. The next hour was a whirlwind of arguments, denials, and desperate attempts to guilt-trip me. My mother launched into a dramatic monologue about how she had sacrificed so much for me growing up, how she had spent sleepless nights worrying about my future, and how it was only fair that I now return the favor. My father, ever the pragmatist, started talking about their financial struggles, emphasizing how difficult it was to make ends meet with my sister's expenses piling up. We were going to tell you, he muttered, swirling the whiskey in his glass. But we knew you'd say no. Exactly, I shouted, exasperated. Because it's my money, my savings. Do you even hear yourselves? I ran a hand through my hair, pacing the kitchen. Every time I tried to reason with them, my mother deflected with emotional manipulation, while my father excused their actions with flimsy justifications. She needed the car, my mother repeated, her voice cracking. She couldn't keep borrowing ours forever. You don't understand. She's struggling. I'm struggling too. I snapped. I worked hard for that money. I sacrificed, I saved, and I let out a bitter laugh. You just took it like it was nothing. My father put his drink down with a loud thud. We'll pay you back. When? I crossed my arms. How? Because right now it sounds like empty promises. Silence. I scoffed, shaking my head. That's what I thought. I looked at them both, my parents, people I had trusted my entire life, and I realized something. I couldn't rely on them anymore. Not in the way I used to. The weight of that realization settled heavily on my shoulders. "You have 1 month," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the rage bubbling underneath. "1 month to pay me back, or I go to the police." My mother burst into tears. "You wouldn't. Try me." I grabbed my coat and turned towards the door. As I reached for the handle, my father spoke up. "Wait." His voice was low, strained. "Just give us time." I paused, then turned back to look at them. 1 month, I repeated, "and I'm serious." Without another word, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, I realized something even worse than losing my money. I had lost my trust in them, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. I waited, giving my parents time to come up with a plan, but every phone call, every interaction was filled with avoidance and empty assurances. My patience was wearing thin, and as the days passed, my anger simmered just beneath the surface. 3 weeks had gone by, and I had heard nothing substantial. No return payments, no concrete promises, just more excuses. My father had stopped answering my calls, and my mother would only text vague apologies, saying they were working on it. I decided I had enough. One evening, I drove back to their house, unannounced. My heart pounded as I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same, familiar and warm, but it no longer felt like home. As I stepped out of my car, I braced myself for what was coming. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I knocked harder this time. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and my mother stood there, her expression unreadable. "Oh, honey, I wasn't expecting you. Where's Dad?" I cut her off, stepping inside. She hesitated. "He's out." I scoffed. "Of course he is. Convenient." She sighed and shut the door behind me. "We're trying, sweetheart. We really are." I turned to face her, the frustration I had been holding back spilling out. "No, Mom, you're not trying. You're avoiding, and I'm done waiting." She wrung her hands, eyes darting away from mine. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," I snapped. "I gave you a deadline. 1 month. I wasn't bluffing. If you don't give me my money back by the end of this week, I'm filing a police report." Her face paled. "You wouldn't do that to us." I let out a bitter laugh. "Wouldn't I? You stole from me, Mom. And now you expect me to just sit back and let it go." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. Not this time. I had spent too long feeling guilty, feeling like I was the bad guy for wanting what was rightfully mine. "We just need more time," she whispered. "Please." "You had time," I said coldly, "and you wasted it." I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, it swung open. My father stepped inside, eyes widening as he saw me standing there. "What's going on?" he asked warily. "Your son is threatening to call the police on us," my mother said, her voice cracking. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Now, let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "I was reasonable when I gave you 1 month to fix this. I was reasonable when I trusted you. But that time is up. I want my money now." He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "Phoenix, we'll figure something out." I narrowed my eyes. "No. No more promises. No more figuring things out. I want a plan." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Give me 2 days." I studied him, searching for any sign of deception. 2 days, I repeated. "If I don't have the full amount by then, I'm calling the police." He nodded slowly. "You'll have it." I didn't thank him. I just turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. I ignored it. I had given them their last chance. 2 days passed, and I waited anxiously for my father's promised solution. I checked my bank account more times than I could count, but no deposit ever appeared. The deadline had come, and this time I wasn't bluffing. I got into my car, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel as I drove back to my parents' house. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and dread. This was it, the moment I had been trying to avoid but knew was inevitable. I knocked on the door, and after a long pause, my mother answered. Her face was tired, eyes red as if she had been crying. "Sweetheart, please," she began, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Where's Dad?" "He's inside," she whispered, stepping aside. I walked in, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. My father was sitting in his chair, looking exhausted, but I didn't care. He looked up at me, and for a brief second, I saw something that almost resembled guilt. Almost. "Did you get my money?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. He sighed. "Son, yes or no?" I snapped. Silence. That was my answer. I exhaled slowly, nodding to myself. "Okay, I gave you a chance. I gave you more than a chance." I pulled my phone out of my pocket, unlocked it, and dialed. "Who are you calling?" my mother asked, panic rising in her voice. "The police," I said simply. Chaos erupted. My mother lunged for my phone, but I stepped back. My father stood up, shaking his head. "Don't do this," he warned, his voice low, almost pleading. "You did this," I shot back, my finger hovering over the call button. "I trusted you, and you stole from me. I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not a pushover. You don't get to walk all over me and expect no consequences." Tears streamed down my mother's face as she grabbed my arm. "Please, please don't do this. We'll figure something out, I swear." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw someone who wasn't my mother. I saw a woman who had betrayed me. A woman who had chosen someone else over me. "Then you should have figured it out before today." I pressed the call button. The ringing felt like it lasted forever. And then a voice. 911. "What's your emergency?" I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay strong. "I need to report a theft." My mother collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. My father stared at me, speechless. There was no going back now. I had given them every opportunity, every warning, and now they had to live with the consequences. The police arrived at my parents' house faster than I expected. Red and blue lights flickered against the windows, casting sharp shadows across the living room walls. My mother sat on the couch, face buried in her hands, while my father stood motionless by the fireplace. Neither of them looked at me. A tall officer stepped inside, glancing between us before speaking. "We received a report of theft." "Who placed the call?" I raised my hand. My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. "I did." The officer nodded and pulled out a small notebook. "Can you explain what happened?" I took a deep breath, then recounted everything. How I discovered the missing money, how I confronted my parents, how they admitted to taking it without my permission. The officer listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. My parents remained silent. After I finished, the officer turned to them. "Is this true? Did you take the money without his consent?" My mother lifted her head, her eyes wet with tears. "We were going to pay him back," she whispered. "We never meant to hurt him." "That's not the question, ma'am," the officer replied evenly. "Did you take the money without his consent?" My father exhaled heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Yes, we did." There it was, the confession. Hearing it spoken aloud, in front of a law enforcement officer, made it feel real in a way that nothing else had. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before flipping his notebook shut. "This is a serious matter. Theft of this amount can carry legal consequences. Since this involves family, we can handle this one of two ways." I tensed, waiting for the options. "First, we can file formal charges, which will begin legal proceedings. This could result in fines, restitution, or even jail time, depending on the circumstances." Or he paused, looking at me. "We can document the complaint as a formal report and recommend mediation, which would give your parents a chance to repay you without legal action. It's up to you." I glanced at my parents. My mother was sobbing quietly, my father staring at the floor, defeated. They had betrayed me, broken my trust in a way that could never be fully repaired. But despite everything, they were still my family. I swallowed hard, then spoke. "I just want my money back." The officer nodded. "Then we'll proceed with mediation. Your parents will be required to sign a legal agreement stating that they will repay the full amount within a designated period. If they fail to comply, legal action will be taken. Does that sound fair?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, that's fair." The officer spent the next half hour drafting the agreement, ensuring that every term was clear. My parents signed without argument, though my father's hands trembled slightly as he held the pen. When it was done, the officers packed up their things and prepared to leave. "We'll be following up in 30 days to make sure payments are being made," the officer said. "If there are any issues, call us." As they walked out, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My parents sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of us. Finally, I turned to them. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I admitted. "But if you don't make this right, I won't hesitate to go through with legal action next time." My father gave a slow nod. "Understood." I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked out without looking back. The night air was cool against my face as I got into my car. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had taken back control of my life. This wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one I needed. The next few weeks felt like a strange limbo. The legal agreement ensured that my parents would start repaying me, and the police officers followed up as promised. But even as I saw the first small payments hit my account, the damage had already been done. The money wasn't the issue anymore. It was the trust, the betrayal, the realization that the people who had raised me had so easily stolen from me. At work, I found it hard to focus. My boss asked if everything was okay, and I just gave a tired nod, unwilling to open up about my personal chaos. My coworkers noticed I was quieter than usual, but they didn't push. I kept my head down, poured myself into my projects, and tried to move past it. But at night, the anger bubbled up again. One evening, my phone rang. It was my sister. "Hey," she said hesitantly. "Can we talk?" I exhaled sharply. "What is there to talk about?" "I didn't know they took the money from you," she said quickly. I swear if I had known, I never would have accepted the car. I leaned back against my couch, rubbing my temples. "You really didn't know?" "No. They told me they had borrowed it from a savings account they had set aside for emergencies. I thought they were just being generous." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe her, but trust in my family felt like something fragile now, something that could be shattered again with a single lie. "I told them they needed to fix it," she continued. "I told them they should sell the car and just give you back what's yours," but Mom freaked out. She said it would embarrass them, that it would look bad. I scoffed. "So their pride is worth more than what they did to me?" "That's what it feels like," she admitted. "I don't know what to do, but I wanted you to know that I didn't mean to be a part of this. And I'm sorry." Her voice was sincere, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small part of the bitterness in my chest loosen. "Thanks for telling me," I said. "But this doesn't just go away overnight." "I know," she said softly. "But I hope one day, things can be better." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. My sister's words had opened up a door in my mind, one that forced me to think beyond just the money and the betrayal. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control what I did next. That weekend, I took the first step. I found a therapist, someone I could talk to about all of it. The anger, the loss of trust, the way my relationship with my parents had fractured. I didn't want to carry this burden alone anymore. The money would come back in time. But healing? That was something I had to work toward, one day at a time. The first real test of my resolve came when my mother called me a few days after my conversation with my sister. I let the phone ring several times before finally answering. "Hello." "Sweetheart," she started, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to check on you. We haven't spoken since everything." I leaned back in my chair, choosing my words carefully. "I'm doing what I need to do, Mom. That's all." She sighed. "I know you're still upset. I know we hurt you. But it's been hard on us, too." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. "Hard on you? Mom, you stole from me. And you expect me to feel bad for you?" No, she said quickly. "That's not what I mean. I miss you. We miss you." For the first time in weeks, something in her voice sounded genuine. But I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. "I don't know if things can ever be the same," I admitted. "I'm trying to move on, but I don't know where that leaves us." "Can we at least try?" she pleaded. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness yet, but I want to work toward it." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell her no, to shut the door on that chapter of my life. But another part, one I wasn't quite ready to admit existed, wanted to believe that we could repair what was broken. "We'll see," I said finally. "But it's going to take time." She exhaled in relief. "That's all I ask. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I had spent so much time being angry, so much time feeling betrayed, that I hadn't considered what came next. Healing wasn't just about moving on from what had happened. It was about deciding what kind of future I wanted to build. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I packed a small bag, got in my car, and drove to the countryside. No plans, no expectations, just the open road. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. This wasn't about escaping the past. It was about reclaiming my future. The countryside trip had given me clarity, but clarity didn't mean closure. When I returned home, reality was waiting for me. The money was still being repaid in slow increments, but my parents hadn't reached out again. It felt like a standoff, each side waiting for the other to make the next move. Then, one evening, I got a text from my father. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them sit with their guilt. But another part, the part that still wanted answers, texted back, "Fine. Tomorrow. My place." The next evening, they arrived together. My mother looked nervous, clutching her purse like it might keep her grounded. My father looked tired, as if the weight of the situation had finally settled on his shoulders. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. We sat in the living room, an awkward silence stretching between us before my father finally spoke. "We owe you an apology." I folded my arms. "Yeah, you do." My mother sniffled. "We thought we were doing what was best for the family." "We thought." Interrupta. "You didn't think about me at all. You just did what was convenient for you." My father nodded slowly. "You're right. We made a terrible mistake." For the first time, there was no justification, no excuses. Just an admission of guilt. It didn't erase what they had done, but it was a start. "We want to fix this," my mother said softly. "Not just the money, us. Our family." I looked between them, searching for any sign of deception. But all I saw was regret. "I don't know how to trust you again," I admitted. "I don't know if I can." My father sighed. "We'll prove it to you, however long it takes." There was a long pause, then I nodded. "All right, but you have to understand, this changes things. We don't go back to the way things were. We move forward carefully." My mother wiped her eyes. "That's all we want." As they left, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Not because things were fixed, but because they were finally facing what they had done. Healing wasn't easy, but at least now it had begun. Weeks turned into months. The payments continued, small but steady, and with every deposit into my account, the weight on my chest lightened. My parents were making an effort, not just with the money, but in other ways too. My mother would send me messages now and then, small check-ins that carried none of the manipulation from before. My father, always the quieter of the two, had even invited me to lunch once, though I wasn't ready for that yet. One evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone. My sister had sent me a picture of the family having dinner together. For the first time, I didn't feel anger seeing it. Just distance. A quiet, detached acceptance that things were different now. And maybe that was okay. I had spent so much time waiting for an apology for closure, but in the end, what mattered was what I did with the experience. Holding on to resentment wasn't hurting them. It was only holding me back. And I was tired of feeling stuck. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I transferred a small portion of my savings into a separate account labeled Future. Not the money my parents had taken, just something for myself. A reminder that my future was in my hands now. Later that week, I called my parents. Not for a confrontation. Not for another fight. Just a conversation. It wasn't warm, it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending everything was fine. It just meant I wasn't going to let their actions define me anymore. I was moving forward, on my own terms. As more months passed, I found myself thinking less and less about the betrayal. My career was thriving, my personal life was stabilizing, and for the first time in a long while I felt hopeful. I even started making travel plans, something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. The idea of experiencing something new, away from all the hurt, excited me in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, I received a final payment notification. The full amount had been repaid. I stared at the screen, expecting to feel triumphant, or maybe relieved. But instead, I just felt free. It was over. With a deep breath, I closed my banking app and walked outside. The sun was shining, the air crisp with the scent of spring. I smiled to myself, feeling lighter than I had in a long, long time. This was my new beginning.